already written and inscribed in the book of life. And then again he says, and now look again, what do you see? He says, the one person in the room that's him, that's not dancing, he's not in the book of life. So he starts crying and he says, Rebbe, he says, I'm not in the book of life. The Rebbe says, there's only one way to get in, you have to dance your way in. So he mama starts dancing like crazy. And that's how the Kotzker Rebbe got another chassid. So there was another, the Kotzker Rebbe heard of one chassid, one little misnagid, another little misnagid, but he wasn't so little. He was a young man, but he was already fire. And his name was Menachem Mendel. Halprin, actually. The story with the Kotzker is his family name was Halprin. It was Halprin, and he was part of there was a coup, there was a revolution in Poland. They tried to secede from Russia, and he was supporting the Polish revolutionaries, and he actually had to run and flee from Poland and go to another country because he was on the wanted list. When he came back, he changed his name to Morgenstern.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So he wasn't originally Morgenstern, he became Morgenstern. And the seer, and he already from a young age, he showed signs of greatness, both as a Eloi, as a child, a prodigy of great intellect, and also as somebody who, in the yeshivas that he went to, strove for perfection, and particularly was trying to serve Hashem, not just in those days, in the non-Hasidic community. Clearly the emphasis was on Torah, was on the learning of Torah, the Hilpul. But he already, even in his non-Hasidic youth, strived with great perseverance to daven every day in the most pure way, to have a intimate spiritual relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God through davening.
Which period was it?
He was born, the Kotzker Rebbe was born in I think it was 1786. I'll give you the exact year. So you know how bad I am with dates. 1787, actually.
It's pretty close.
Yeah. It's not bad after. And that story, by the way, he changed his name only after 1831, so it was many years later, when he changed his name after that revolution, the Polish Revolution.
That's why I asked,
So he was already, he lived a relatively long age for somebody. He lived into his 70s, which back then, if you lived to 70, was Arichas Yamim. It was a long life. Today, I think they say that 70 is a new 50, or something like that. You ever heard that? I just heard that recently. Okay. But back then, he lived a Arichas Yamim. So he went to the seer of Lublin, and the seer of Lublin, there was some interactions they had, there were some stories they had. But what was happening is, the seer of Lublin, the emphasis became, the seer of Lublin was very intense. But it was definitely about the courts. Which meant there wasn't necessarily enough time for individual assessment of each chassid to become like the potential that they could be. And in fact, there would be criticisms of the Polish Chassidim, the Polish schools, both from other Hasidic schools, who would criticize it of becoming too much of a emphasis on the Rebbe's courts, and not enough emphasis on the individual's avoda, the individual's divine service and their own work and their inner work on their self. So, although you wouldn't necessarily say this about the seer's court as much as the courts that may have followed his, but there was already a little bit of discontent. So possibly his greatest chassid at that time was Reb Yaakov. Their all name was Yaakov. They had to be Yaakov Yosef, Yitzchak Yaakov Yitzchak. That was the popular name at that time. So one of the greatest chassidim, if not the greatest follower of his, was known. So Yaakov Yosef, he was the what? No, that was earlier. Halanya was the chassid of Baal Shem Tov. He was known as the Yid HaKadosh.
Oh yes.
To be known as the Yid HaKadosh, to be known as the Holy Jew, a title of that nature is already, goes without saying, very, very, very strong. So the Kotzker was still young, and the Yid HaKadosh created a breakaway movement. And the Kotzker followed him out of Lublin and into Pshischa. And in Pshischa, there's considered a line, a straight line from the Yid HaKadosh and Simcha Bonim of Pshischa, which is the Rebbe that followed him, and the Kotzker was the Rebbe that followed the Simcha Bonim of Pshischa. Those three created a line that some people see as Pshischa Kotzk, as a dynasty in and of its own right, as a breakaway from Lublin. And Chani asked me earlier, where does it exist today? And the answer is, to some extent, in different Hasidic dynasties. For example, Sachachav, which is a son-in-law of the Kotzker and the grandson of the Kotzker. But in particular, living today, you have the Ger Hasidim, because a contemporary of the Kotzker was Yitzchak Meir Alter of Ger. And they were, by the way, these people, like, they were, some of them were the same age, or just a few years younger, but they would be the students. Sometimes they were even older than the Rebbe. They'd be the student, and then when the Rebbe would pass on, they would be the Rebbe. And often there was a son and a disciple who was older than the son, and it split the dynasty. And this is quite often the case what happened. And this did happen a number of times. So, for example, when the Simcha Bunim passed away, it wasn't that everybody went to the Kotzker. Some people went with the son of the Simcha Bunim. Others went, including Isaac of Varka, Yitzchak Varka, who was a good friend of the Kotzker, but he went with the son of Simcha Bunim, and eventually he became the Rebbe. Yitzchak Varka became his own Rebbe. So there were all these branches. We really need a family tree. I'm really not a good historian. I'm very bad with.
Yeah, you should have printed out something.
I should print out for you and for myself.
Where did this take place? Was it in Lublin?
This is the outskirts of Lublin. Lublin was still the center of this activity. These were in surrounding cities, 20 miles, 50 miles away.
So what the breakaway, the descendants of Simcha Bunim, what would they?
They were, they were Pshischa. But Kotzk and Pshischa are the same, and they were at the same time different branches. So I'll just tell you some stories, tell you some of Shlomo's stories that bring these Rebbes